Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to all joining us live or watching the recording later. I'm Zeynep Engin, Director of Data for Policy Community Interest Company and Editor-in-Chief of Data and Policy Journal that we publish with Cambridge University Press. Today, we are here to discuss an important and timely piece of research by Karen Yeung and Wenlong Li, recently published in Data and Policy Journal. Their article examines live facial recognition trials carried out by European law enforcement between 2016 and 2020 and draws out lessons for how we might conduct in the wild AI testing in a more principled and responsible way. They argue that the current landscape of real-world AI testing, particularly for surveillance technologies, has resembled something of a Wild West themselves, unregulated, opaque, and posing significant risks to its individual rights. We are very fortunate to be joined by Pete Fussey, whose work on surveillance, human rights, and policing, including his recent book, Facial Recognition Surveillance, Policing and Human Rights in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, provides an essential perspective on these issues. His insights will help us consider not only whether such frameworks are viable, but what responsible testing should look like in practice. Over the next hour, we will first hear from Karen and Wenlong about their proposed framework and lessons from real-world trials. Then we'll invite Pete to reflect on their findings and share his critical insights. And finally, we'll open the floor to your questions and discussion. So please prepare any points you'd like to make. The stakes are high. Facial recognition is not just about technical innovation. It's a powerful socio-technical system that shapes how we live in public, how law enforcement operates, and how our rights are protected. The way we test such systems now may set a precedent for years to come. So just a bit of introduction to our first speaker, Karen Yeung, who is an interdisciplinary professorial fellow in law, ethics, and informatics at the University of Birmingham Law School, whose research has been at the forefront of understanding the challenges associated with the regulation and governance of emerging technologies. And Dr. Wenlong Li, a research professor at Zhejiang University in China, specializing in data and AI regulation. With that, I'm delighted to hand over to Karen and Wenlong to introduce their work. Over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Zaina. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to try and share my slides. I'm really rubbish with technology, so I'm just going to press this button that says share, and hopefully you can see my slides.
We can see your screen and now actually emails.
Okay, that's not what I wanted you to see. I got a minute. Okay, just going to go back to Zoom. That one. You say, I told you I was hopeless with technology. Let's come back here. I will unshare, share. Okay. Now can you see my slides?
We are still seeing your Outlook. Yes, now slides.
Yay, hooray. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to now try and play from the start. Let me just give you a little bit of background to this. Some years ago, I think back in 2021, I gave a data and policy keynote at the annual conference where I shared the findings or the emerging findings from a project that Wenlong and I were working on together to explore how the in-the-wild testing of live facial recognition systems was being conducted by 4 law enforcement authorities across Europe. And owing to the very long list of things that got in the way, we never quite got around to finishing it. So it took us a number of years finally to write it up, but I'm delighted to be able to speak to the polished article that is available in Data and Policy now. I've got about 16 slides that I've literally cobbled together in 20 minutes. And I find it kind of amazing that there's a button that can turn my articles into a podcast, but I haven't found an app that can turn my articles into really nice slides. So if anybody knows of any, can you please share them in the chat? And that would have saved me a lot of stress. But anyway, these are human created slides. And for that reason, they're very boring. Ta-da, the next one, as you'll see, has no formatting whatsoever other than plain white. Are you seeing my slide? No, they're not moving. Okay, I have to do this.
They are moving, but maybe you might want to make it a full screen, perhaps.
Okay. How do I? for some bizarre reason, play from start, slideshow, full screen.
At the bottom on the right-hand side, just
Did I?
next to, not there, but just next to the
No.
zooming function. Yeah, that should be it.
View. Will that be view? No. Normal, slide sorter, slide master.
Yeah, I think that's fine. We can manage it like
Is
that.
that okay? So I've got it full screen on one of my screens, but you're obviously seeing the little one.
Okay, all right. Let's take the one.
Sorry, let's just go with what we have. There is at least content that you can read. Okay, enough throat clearing. So let me just quickly set the context, and then I'll really race you through the core elements of the article and what it is that we did in this study. Let's just set the scene. I'm sure you're all very familiar with various sites at which various kinds of AI tools and software are being tested in real world context. So I'm sure you'll all know that lab testing of software is part of the development process for digital tools, but some tools are tested in the wild, not all of them. There's no requirement that they should be tested in the wild. Some of them very high profile, autonomous cars being the one that sticks out in my mind. But of course, as our experience with driverless cars shows us, testing itself can be a dangerous process for other people. So the purpose of this study was to examine how in the wild testing of AI tools and systems is undertaken and governed in the wild. And what we found is that it is a Wild West. It's a largely ungoverned space, which is really quite different from the governance of a scientific testing for scientific purposes within academic institutional contexts, which are very tightly governed, as many of you will know, through the Declaration of Helsinki. It's not the same when it comes to R&D testing, and it's sort of like almost anything goes. And to try and get more concrete about what is actually happening on the ground, we undertook a fairly in-depth study of 4 facial recognition trials in the wild conducted by law enforcement authorities across Europe to try and identify how it was that these tests were conducted and how they proceeded. So let me just start by giving some context. Have your slides moved? Can I just check whether you're seeing why test AI systems? Cool, thank you. Why test AI systems in the world? Well, I guess there's a question of why do we test anything? And happily, there's a really rich body of insight from STS, which has examined the sociology of testing. And this body of work grew out of earlier work in the sociology of knowledge. And it's been subject to quite detailed critical examination and a number of key papers, which demonstrate that testing is a really important means for acquiring knowledge about the world and to produce demonstrable evidence that the thing that's being tested meets some pre-specified purpose. So Trevor Pinch gives the idea of a rock band warming up before a concert, conducting some sound tests. It's pretty obvious that they're just trying to check that all of their equipment works. Something I didn't do to my slides before I turned up today, but nevertheless, we're hoping that it works today. So we know that when it comes to the rigor of the scientific method, it's important to demonstrate conformity with a number of principles that apply to ensuring or supposedly ensuring the epistemic integrity of the scientific results produced from the testing purposes. So the whole point being to try and create in the scientific endeavor reliable, replicable truth claims for which methodological rigor is really essential to demonstrate that these findings are universally true in these specific contexts. And that's why we have a quite rigorous set of methodological principles about how we do scientific testing and how we expect it to be done. And we also have, as I'll shortly come to, a set of principles that govern how it should be conducted to ensure that research participants are not harmed or otherwise wronged in the process. When it comes to in the wild testing of technology, however, we're moving outside formal scientific contexts. And indeed, if you think of the R&D department of a company that's trying to produce new innovations, testing in the wild can be a really important step in addressing uncertainties about whether or not the new innovation that they're trying to develop actually delivers on the promises of the firm that's trying to develop the technology. So we are not against in the wild testing at all. We actually think it's a really valuable step in the process of facilitating responsible and trustworthy innovation. So there's an important step to be done between devising something that appears to perform well in a lab to whether or not it can actually deliver specific operational benefits in the field for people as promised by the developer. So in the wild testing is useful, but the problem is it can be dangerous. It can result in harm to others, which we know from the testing of autonomous vehicles, and it can lead to wrongs to others. And there are some pretty egregious examples that you're probably familiar with: nuclear weapons testing during the Cold War, and of course the egregious research abuses that were carried out during the Nazi period by Nazi scientists in concentration camps. As a result of that, the Declaration of Helsinki was agreed, and that is a set of ethical principles that governs the conduct of human subject research that is carried out under the name of science. But the problem is R&D testing does not fall within the rubric of scientific investigation. So it's not directly, or at least not necessarily, governed by the Declaration of Helsinki. And in the absence of that, there appear to be few guidelines at all concerning how R&D testing of anything, let alone AI technology, are actually conducted. So to start off with, we thought, well, what would in the wild testing of digital technologies look like if it were to be conducted responsibly? We couldn't find any guidelines. All we could find were principles of research integrity for the conduct of scientific testing and experimentation, but nothing about in the wild testing of a technology. So that prompted me to think about, well, what is it that we really need to ensure if we want to do in the wild testing responsibly? And we suggest that there are three kinds of responsibility that need to be demonstrated in the design and conduct of in the wild testing of digital technologies. The first one is that the knowledge that you generate from the test should have integrity, and it should be reliable and trustworthy, and it must produce sound knowledge of the things that it was seeking to test. So there need to be some safeguards to ensure that it's not nonsense. Yeah, that the evidence that was produced from the test is reliable and trustworthy. But there's a need to clarify, what is it that we're trying to test when we test a digital technology in the wild? And here we draw a really important distinction that is typically overlooked in the current policy and scientific discourse, and that is testing whether the functional performance of a software tool is as it claims to be, and testing whether or not it is effective in delivering operational benefits for the organization seeking to deploy it. And as we'll see when we talk about facial recognition systems, it's one thing for a facial recognition system to accurately match the face of a person in a crowd with an image that's uploaded on a watch list. It's another thing altogether to deploy that technology in an open, crowded setting, and then to apprehend that person whose face is generating an alert to the officer on the ground, and then to lawfully apprehend that person and take them into custody. That requires a lot more to be done in order to actually deliver on the claimed benefits of FRT for law enforcement authorities, and it is a legal and ethical minefield, which I will shortly come to. So we need to clarify what it is that we're testing. We need to make sure that we're testing in an ethically responsible way, so we avoid causing harm or wrongdoing to others, and it should also comply with all applicable laws. So that's the provisional framework of principles that we want to test, I guess, when we look more deeply at for concrete sites where in the wild FRT testing was carried out. And that leads us to our 4 case studies. The ones that we chose were carried out between 2016 and 2020 in Europe by law enforcement authorities in London, Wales, Berlin, and Nice. We chose these for pragmatic reasons, that we could find publicly available information about them in English. And they were also provided a very rich set of case studies that enabled us to do some critical comparison. So before I start, I'm just going to hand over to Wenlong just to give you a little bit of background about what FRT actually is and how it's intended to work. And then we'll have a quick look at the trials themselves. So Wenlong, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And I hope everyone can hear me all right. I think I would do it badly because this is the first time I see Karen's slide as well. But I'll try best to recall some of the memories about writing this paper. So perhaps there are a few characteristics about the FRT, the facial recognition technologies, that are worth mentioning. So I recall that at a certain point, we tend to entitle this paper as CCTV on stories. Maybe Karen still remember that. By that, we actually want to emphasize the fact that actually this facial recognition technology is a form of AI that builds upon the CCTV cameras that's able to record and capture continuous supplies of footage, which can be then used to match against a predetermined database. That is the images of, the members of the public, or, in sometimes persons of interest. And that actually raises a lot of troubles and leading to issues such as bias and inaccuracies. Another feature about facial recognition to mention is that it can be used in various cases. For instance, you can use the technology to identify a person in a one-to-one scenario, or if you have the image or the official template of a certain person and you're in the watch list, you can actually use the technologies to locate or identify a person in the crowd. So that's the 2 typical type of use cases which have been tested across different jurisdictions as well. And the one last feature about facial recognition is that although we call it facial recognition, the same type of technology can be used and has been used, for instance, in the German trials to identify what the police would call dangerous object or behavior. So the patterns, not just the facial characteristics, but whatever that can be defined mathematically. So that's, I think, are the 3 key characteristics of facial recognition technology that are essential to this paper, with which we consider its regulatory, legal, and ethical implications. And a few more words about the case studies. So this was conducted, as Karen said, at the time when we were locked literally in our flats. So what the best we can do is actually to find what's available online. And that's also a time when the law enforcement agencies across Europe are quite keen on, playing with the sort of technologies. So as we know, there are actually far more instances than the 4 case studies, including our paper, but we chose them, as Karen said, purely because these cases are those we have, evidence with which we can perform our analysis. And it's quite quite contrasting in the sense that, the British trials conducted in London and Wales actually tested things that are quite distinct from those European trials. So it were called by Welsh and by London police as trials, but actually those trials gave rise to some really worrying incidents, such as, just people being stopped and even arrested as a result of the trials. As
Wenlong, do you want to pass that back to me now? Because I've got a couple of little slides I can show of it.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So
Okay.
a quick and dirty snapshot of these trials. So the London Met Police conducted 10 operational trials, they called them, to identify individuals they actually wanted. Yeah, real targets in a wide variety of open public environments, ranging from the Notting Hill Carnival to the Stratford Shopping Centre. The picture of the FRT van outside the Stratford Centre. The watch list sizes varied considerably. Across the 10 trials, 27 alerts were generated that resulted in police actually engaging individuals out in the field, or in public, should I say. 10 of those were correct identifications, which shows that 17 of them were not. On that basis, they arrested 9 people. And all of that, they scanned 18,000 faces. That's 18,000 faces people whose privacy was interfered with without their consent, and they made 9 arrests. And we're not actually told what the crime was for which they were arrested. In Wales, they were even more expansive, 69 operational trials in the period under investigation, a wide variety of public settings, including, controversially, a peaceful arms protest, a very wide-changing nature of the watch lists. Yeah, the preloaded database of faces of people they wanted to catch, and the sources of their images varied considerably, including using images they had scraped from websites. Anyway, some of you will know the South Wales police trials were challenged in court, and they failed at first instance, but the Court of Appeal ruled that those deployments were in fact unlawful on a variety of grounds: breach of data protection, equality law, and the Human Rights Act. In Berlin and Nice, the other 2 trials we looked at, they were quite different because they used volunteer participants. So in these 2 settings, they didn't actually try and catch live targets. So instead, we have one site in Berlin, in Secret railway station, where the trial organisers were able to recruit approximately 500 volunteers to participate over a 6-month period. They were given a little transmitter to wear, and they tried to pass in front of the cameras, and the purpose was to see if the cameras correctly identified them by comparing their facial images they passed the cameras with the preloaded watch list. There was a section of the station which allowed passers-by to avoid the cameras. You can see there's a little blue sign there that shows you where the cameras are, and if you want to avoid it, you can walk on the other side. And ultimately, based on the study that was conducted, even though it was claimed to be actually quite successful, it was decided by the German Minister of the Interior not to proceed with installing FRT software in German train stations and airports. In Nice, an even more modest trial in 2019, 3 days only at the Notting Hill Carnival, just at this little entrance. And there are a lot of security guards there. So there are a lot of people wandering around, waiting for people to pass through the entrance. Only 8 volunteer participants, 6 cameras, and then anyone who was coming through could choose to go through the entrance and then have their face scanned as well, but you could use another entrance if you wanted. The trial was hailed as a success by the Mayor of Nice, but the basis upon which that is not clear. So you can see very, very different kinds of trials, very different periods, all sorts of variables, very different. The one difference that I wanted to highlight, and Wenlong has already mentioned, if we consider those 3 basic principles that we suggest should govern, Let's start with epistemic integrity. Were the findings generated and the results generated from these testing processes valid and reliable and trustworthy? Well, that depends on what you were testing for. And here there's a noticeable distinction between the Berlin and the Nice trials, where they used volunteer participants, where they were simply trying to test for what you might call in-domain functional performance. In other words, they wanted to test, does the software accurately identify whether there is a correct match between a person passing in front of the camera and a preloaded database of faces. They were volunteers, and so there was no attempt then to apprehend them in the real world. So it was just trying to test moving outside of the laboratory, because you get very impressive scores for FRT accuracy when you look at the software performance, but they're all tested typically in laboratory settings, which are highly controlled and very different to the kinds of messy real world settings in which the public is moving in a very dynamic way. So they were trying modestly to test for in-domain functional performance with volunteers. In contrast, if you look at the London and the Welsh trials, they're actually trying to catch people of interest, people who are wanted live targets out in the real world. So they were not primarily concerned with functional performance, whether the software accurately identified people's faces to a watch list, although that was part of what they needed to do. But they did need to do very much more to demonstrate that that technology was actually genuinely useful to the police in catching the wanted persons in the field. In other words, was it operationally effective to serve the organizational goals of the deploying organization? And to do that, even if there was a match alert, they needed to translate that match alert into on-the-ground action to lawfully apprehend a person in the field and test, firstly, is that in fact the person who we want? And secondly, they need to make the apprehension act in accordance with legal requirements concerning the exercise of police powers. And that itself is a legally fraught and sensitive matter. So when we then think about whether or not the trials themselves were conducted in an ethically and legally responsible way, we can then compare, based on all of these headings that I have on this slide, all of the trials across these variables. And we see that actually for the trials in Berlin and Nice, they were on much more secure ground in demonstrating the legality and the ethical validity of the way in which they conducted their tests, even though there was criticism of some aspects, particularly the question of informed consent of the volunteers and those whose faces were captured. But when it came to the London and Welsh trials, it was extremely fraught. Here we're really fortunate to have Pete with us, because we drew very heavily from Pete and Darren Murray's very detailed independent evaluation of the London trials, which very usefully identified what actually happens in that period between the generation of a match alert and trying to lawfully apprehend a person who is in fact wanted by police, and who counts as wanted, whose face gets to be plastered onto that watch list, and do we have any transparency about that? There are lots of questions that remain unsatisfactorily answered based on our investigations, and I suspect, well, I know they continue to be, because the size of the watch lists that British police have been using is now in the hundreds of thousands, so they're not even the modest sizes that were used in the London trial. Another thing we found, that there was a lack of clear governance and oversight of all of the trials examined, but it was really difficult to find public information. There was a failure to specify in advance the metrics and thresholds for evaluating whether the test was successful. And it was particularly true of the non-technical elements of the trial. And just to give you an example of just how poor quality the evaluation of these trials was, I think the MPS, in response to criticism, commissioned their own evaluation of their trials by the National Physical Laboratory. and that is publicly available. And in that 2020 report, the NPL concludes that live facial recognition will be an effective policing tool that helps MPS to apprehend dangerous offenders and make London a safer place. But on our examination of that report, that conclusion was not defended on the basis of the evidence that was provided in that report. So that takes us to some large reflections on these trials. And we were really, I suppose, struck by the difference between the Wild West that is currently in place for the testing of digital technologies in the wild and the very demanding and detailed process of evaluating whether new drugs are safe to be made publicly available. And I was particularly prompted by a wonderful paper by David Spiegelhalter in the Harvard Data Science Review on trustworthy AI, where he just asks, why is it that we are so sloppy about testing AI technologies when we are so rigorous about testing drugs? And he says, in particular, all of these tests are going ahead and seeming to take it for granted that they deliver real-world benefits, but no testing is done to actually generate evidence in support of that. And so on that basis, we develop a table imagining what a structured evaluation might look like for FRT and for AI systems more generally. That takes us to our conclusion, which is it's a wild west out there. We need to govern these much more tightly and much more responsibly. There is some potential for that under the EU AI Act, and we suggest that these three principles of epistemic, ethical, and legal responsibility should be the foundations. And even for accepting the use of FRT in particular, given its intrusive nature and the basic threat that it poses to democracy owing to its capabilities as a mass surveillance tool of choice, we think a very high evidence threshold is required before they should be accepted for public use and on very narrowly specified terms. And we suggest that FRT might be regarded as akin to thalidomide, embraced without rigorous testing, and that may ultimately cause a lot of damage before we do something about it. Thank you. Over to Pete.
Great, thank you both. Would you like me to just give some reflections, and I'll be fairly brief as well. First of all, I really enjoyed reading your paper, and I'm glad you were kind to us as well about our work, so thank you for that. I'm just reading from the fact that you've got 6,500 unanswered emails, Karen, from but no, seriously, I thought it was a good paper. As Karen said, I was one of the reviewers of the Met Police trials, so I was in the surveillance van, had access to their trial methodology and sort of their briefings and all their sort of documentation and so on. You know, and I think you've really picked up on something that was really giving attention to an issue that we thought was important at the time, but in our public reporting, we restricted it to issues we knew we could stand over 100% and were prepared to have a public debate over it. So we had to sort of be quite sort of focused on what we say, given we knew it would be sort of quite politicised report, and indeed there was quite a lot of fallout afterwards, to put it mildly. So I think you've really picked up on something. I think one of the interesting things when we were doing the study was to think about how almost like the language of a trial was being used in order to circumvent some of the human rights implications. So we actually, apart from sort of in the title, calling it their what they call a trial, we avoided the language of trials in our report and everything we've written since, because we agree there weren't really trials in the sense that a scientist would understand them. So yeah, I think your choice of case was good. I also spoke to the people responsible for the other trials that you mentioned as well. So I went on one of the South Wales police operations, but we put it in the book it just as a footnote, really. When I went, it felt more like they were just showcasing the technology, so I didn't really in good conscience think I could use it as a research visit. The other ones were sort of as part of working with the European Fundamental Rights Agency, and it was quite interesting how the people involved in the Berlin trial, this is what they said to me. We were in a human rights meeting, but I do think it was good faith. They said also during the trial they weren't really sure about the legal basis of the technology. So they were having their doubts and thought about pausing it until the Reichstag could then legislate around it. And then we had the pandemic. And, you know, I think that was really interesting how from that kind of post-authoritarian context where those police were operating, just the difference in attitude compared to the UK, where it was just, let's just try it and see if anyone complains, which I thought was interesting. I thought the paper was great. I thought your emphasis on epistemic integrity was really important. You know, something we've sort of criticised in our work really is about how the language of testing really isn't about testing, it's about legitimation. And it's almost, as Gaston Bachelard, the philosopher of science, talks about how science is polemical. And it's certainly, I think the idea of trial is being used in a very polemical way. It's very decorative to almost like legitimate a use of technology. And, you know, in our work, we've looked in a parallel way at the language of human rights, necessity calculations, and so on, which seem to perform a similar function. They look like they're robust human rights assessments, but they're actually not. They're just legitimating devices. And we can see that I think, make a good case in your paper with the NPL independent reporting. You know, it looks like independent research, but if you look into it, well, apart from there's an accusation of expert shopping, they don't talk about our independent review that was critical, but the independent one that wasn't critical, they're quite keen to trump it. But there were two reports done into the Met trials or the Met uses. One that you talk about extensively, where they use two different data sets, depending on what argument they want to use, and in every case, it shows FRT in the best light. So it's not really. And then the second one is the one that the police and politicians and people in the Home Office are overclaiming, saying that the algorithm, there's no racial bias in the algorithm, which there is. If you read the report, the study it's based on, there is. In that study, the independent report of demographic variance in FRT, they talk about these different cases as being significant. There were 7 cases. So FRT scans millions of faces every year. They use 7 cases to justify their argument. And each one of these cases of a false positive, it's a person of colour that's wrongfully identified. And then they say it's not statistically significant because they put these other statistics in. So it's entirely polemical the way it's being used in public. So I think it's really, really important that you've brought attention to this, and I think sort of moving towards how we can have that epistemic integrity is really important. The other points you made, I think, in the paper were interesting around the lack of methodology. So we were supplied with the Met Police methodology as part of our independent review. It wasn't really clear to us whether we were allowed to sort of talk about it publicly, so we kind of erred on the side of caution. But I think it's not betraying confidence to say that, you know, and we do say this in our work, that the methodology was poorly specified. So it would have very broad categories such as, is it useful for a policing purpose? But then you wouldn't have, you know, as you would have in a research proposal, well, what are the ways of measuring? That's how do you define value for policing purpose? How would you measure it, and so on? And I think something else you talk about in the paper, which I think is really important, and something we encounter a lot in our work as well, is the way, you know, systems like this are kind of technical, so they are tested in a lab, as you say, but then there's the issue of ecological validity once that's used in the wild or in the real world. Now, why that's really important is obviously at the same time you have this parallel discourse by everyone who uses this technology to say, well, there's always humans scrutinising it, there's a human in the loop. So, which is true. I mean, we criticise the quality of that human adjudication in our work, but it is true. They're social technical systems. So therefore, any kind of evaluation has to understand the human scrutiny element of that. And I think they're very, very technical. They're very selective in the audits. And why that's important is several reasons. One is, as I've said, to test the quality of human capability of people to hold systems to account. Another, if we're talking about the most controversial issue, which is about, you know, sort of race, ethnicity, and diversity, so that there's a difference in how an algorithm spots and can measure people of different ethnicities is one thing. But psychological research will tell us that we are better at recognising people of the same ethnicity to us. We're more exposed to it, and from childhood and so on. And so if you've got a human making a decision on somebody who, let's say the majority of police officers are from one ethnicity, and there's no representation of suspects from another, let's say for argument's sake, there is necessarily a human sort of deficiency there that's not tested. And then again, success is measured in very complex and selective ways. So I was on an operation in Romford, which it collapsed because there were too many, the machine elicited too many false positives. So too many police officers were engaging with and doing ID checks on people who were completely wrongly identified, that they ran out of people to deal with it, or they were chasing down people, avoiding cameras with small amounts of drugs on them, whatever it was. So that's not part of the audit, of the technical audit, but it is obviously relevant to success. So I think those were some issues. There's another ethical issue, I think, about public bodies using testing commercial systems and that data being commercially valuable as well. So I think just to sort of wrap up on that as well, I think there are really interesting issues about who does this testing and where it happens. We're constantly told about professional, robust mechanisms within sort of the police and people who use this, but there's an issue about trust and trustworthiness. So trustworthiness, particularly in the wake of countless reports talking about the lack of effective internal oversight for policing measures, the best way to get public trust is to have independent scrutiny. I think of that. So who does this testing is really, really important. And then, you talk also in your paper, I thought really interestingly about the AI Act, in the EU AI Act. Compliance mechanisms aren't necessarily established yet in the AI Act, and when they do become established, I have a degree of skepticism over their ability. So the addition of or how we think about proper, routine, independent testing, where there is robust kind of scrutiny on these tools that's held up for public accountability, are really, really important. And I thought the other thing, just finally, on your paper that was interesting was the issue of consent. I had an online spat with someone recently about this, and then it just got undignified for everybody. But the issue of consent is really interesting. So when we talk about policing by consent, that doesn't mean that everybody has to consent to it. There is this kind of, going back from, well, you're a lawyer, so you read Locke and Kant and all of these people. But, going from there, the idea of consent is complex. But when we're talking about trials, there's a different formulation of consent, as you say, the ability to withdraw consent without penalty, for example, being one of them, as well as informed consent. So I think it's really interesting. I've not thought it through in much detail, but I think there's some substance there, thinking about what you've done and the work we've done around how consent becomes much more complicated once you're sort of trialing policing technology, where it's no longer just about policing by consent, but you have these other formulations and layering almost of consent there. So all that to say, I thought it was a great article, a really important intervention. And it's also not just one of these papers that just sort of sets things out. Yeah, it's actually a really good vehicle for developing the conversation. It certainly led me to sort of reflect and think about our own work as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Pete. We really, really value that independent report. I think I've read it more carefully than anyone. I bet you thought, I'm going to read this very big, thick report, but I did. Thank you. Sorry, Zainab, over to you.
No, not at all. So well, first of all, a call to attendees of this webinar. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or share it in the chat. In the meantime, Karen and Wenlong, if you'd like to respond to anything that Pete raised, this is your time. I have got a couple of questions, but that can come later.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I'm really fascinated to hear what you said about they weren't really trials, they were just vehicles for legitimating politically what was going on. And that was exactly my sense of the London and the Welsh trials. And I think we call them show trials in the end. So these aren't trials, these are show trials. This is like a performing pony to demonstrate, to try and give flesh to the agenda that a particular organization is trying to push forward. And I think that idea of it's a legitimating tool that's being used where on the surface it looks like they're abiding by good governance norms, but you just push a little bit deeper and the substance is just not there. So I'm seeing this everywhere in the AI governance space, and I find it really disturbing. Actually, sometimes I think maybe we'd be better off with nothing, because at least we're being honest that there is nothing there to actually operate as safeguards. So yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Just got a very quick thing to come back to on that, actually. Sorry. Yeah, I think it's interesting because they're not really trials in the way that we would see them. I mean, I think it is really important also. I feel like I should be fair to the police a little bit in terms of one or two of the things I encountered. What I thought was really interesting was, the people involved in sort of deploying this technology in the Met Police, they were, they were trying to do the right thing, acting in good faith, but they're not human rights lawyers. And you'd ask them about like the human rights implication, the list legislation, you go, well, but they're also, some of them were published scholars that have done evaluative research. But the problem was, I felt that they were just being lumbered with everything. They were being, the public consultation and things like that. And it was kind of too much, really. Whereas what was really interesting with the smaller force, like South Wales, was they had top cover. The deputy chief at the time, who is now very senior in the Met, and he might be the next Met commissioner, and he was also trying to do the right thing, but they had, they protected the unit within the police. They tried to think about it. They did try and consult, but there was like more of an institutional infrastructure around them. With the Met, it was kind of a group of people that I felt they were overloaded with having to do everything. So a lot of these things just didn't get done, and it's not their specialism. So I think the way the institutions approached it differently, I thought was quite interesting. But yeah, just a quick observation on that. But I agree with the substance of what you were saying, but just some context. But yeah.
Thank you very much. So I see that Stefan has a question. Stefan is one of our co-editors for the Data and Policy Journal. Can we bring him to speak, actually? Stefan, would you like to ask it directly yourself? Andrew, can we do that? Or shall I just read the question?
We can invite Stefan to speak if he wants to.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, no, super interesting presentation and great reflections as well. I mean, I was just reflecting a little bit at the end when you compared the testing that you proposed with testing that happens within the pharmaceutical context, and I really, anyway, I like the analogy, but I think it's also somewhat limited, and I think we have to be honest that AI is not the same as drugs. It's far more dynamic, and also it's kind of very unclear what is the product. And so the question I had, so what is the product here that needs to be tested, and how do we define what the product is? And then secondly, of course, a lot of the kind of testing that you described was what I would call in the pharma context kind of pre-market testing. And some decided not to go to market. But then, of course, with AI, it's far more, with drugs, it's far harder to, anyway, manipulate drugs once approved. But with AI, anyway, it just needs to, it's just a button, basically. And so how do you deal with that kind of post-market evaluation?
Yeah, so all really good questions. I agree that the analogy only goes so far. And one of the real challenges of digital, not just AI, but any digital system, is the elasticity of software. You can easily repurpose it. And so the problem with shift and drift is massive. Having said all of that, I've sort of started to warm on the AI Act. I mean, there are lots of reasons why the AI Act is really deeply problematic, and I won't give you that lecture today. But interestingly, for high-risk systems, the product is specified by reference to its intended purpose and reasonably foreseeable misuse. But the obligations of the provider must be clearly specified with reference to the intended purpose. And then the obligations, at least of disclosure, must extend to reasonably foreseeable misuse. and they must be disclosed in the instructions for use. And then it becomes the deployer's obligations to adhere to the instructions for use. So it passes the legal responsibility onto the deployer, saying, I've told you that you can't use it for these purposes, even though it's perfectly readily contemplatable that somebody might misuse the technology for, you know, like a creative content manipulation tool starts to be used for purposes of propaganda and deep fakes and all that sort of stuff. Now, at least the deployer can say that is not the intended purpose. Now, the trouble, of course, with the AI Act is that even those don't come under the high risk category. So I think it is possible to specify the intended purpose, but it is artificial. But let's be honest, that's what the law does, right? It puts boundaries around things and says, here, if you belong in that boundary, you got to do these things. So I think there are ways that we can structure an institutional framework to put safeguards in place. But the problem really is on the ground that there are a bundle of, you know, malicious, opportunistic, even if not malicious, there are loads of opportunistic actors. You know, you can tweak software very easily, very cheaply, and then you can put it out there at scale, and the scams proliferate. So I think that it's not that easy to create drugs and get them out there at scale in the same way. So I think that's really a massively significant challenge. And we're already seeing that with deepfake imagery of everything. Like, how can you trust anything on the internet these days? There is just slop out there that is magnifying exponentially, and we don't really have any way of testing it. So I totally agree, Stefan. Actually, where the rubber hits the road is in real world use for opportunistic and exploitative purposes, and we can't really control that at the moment. And I'm not sure how we're going to actually put that genie back in the bottle. So I agree with you. I'm worried about that too. Sorry, that's not very helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. We have just a few minutes left. I will ask two things, actually, two questions, and you can choose to respond either or both. Well, the first one is quite following the previous question in a way as well. So you said that the amongst the tests, the UK tests were unlawful. Basically, it came down to that. But they ended up with a few criminals identified in some way. So that's the purpose of maybe the trial in the end. But that happened at the expense of human rights violations for a much larger number of people as well. But the ones that were in the Europe, they were voluntary, but voluntary involvement is always, well, the criminals won't volunteer to through those steps, basically. So given that, well, that makes it in a way meaningless as well, because with drug testing, for example, if you're ill, you might want to try something. But that's not the case in this situation. So given the risks to this, like privacy, equality, freedom of assembly and issues that you have observed, is it really possible to test live facial recognition in a way that meaningfully protects human rights, or there are inherent limits to what responsible testing can achieve in the wild? The other thing is, I mean, you have well, the case studies that you have got are from 2016 and 2020. We have something, well, that were the time when we were talking of regulating, auditing individual AI systems. Whereas since 2022, we are talking about world models, LLMs, foundation models, and we're already in a way in real world, so it's a wild testing environment in many ways. How do you envision that your subject of interest, basically in this case, is changing, and in this sort of environment? If you were to do this research again today, what would be the design?
Good questions, Zainab. On your first one, I still think it's possible to do responsible live FRT testing if it's small scale and rigorously structured and subject to oversight, proper governance and oversight at very specific sites. And you will have to rely on legitimate interest rather than informed consent, because not everybody's going to consent if you're actually testing on live populations. And that's why you need to be very, very careful with how you design them and how you govern them. And it won't have the epistemic and ethical foundations of a scientific test, because you won't have everybody consenting, but you should at least establish legitimate interest under data protection law. So I think it is possible to do it, but I don't see anybody doing it because it would be a major faff, to be perfectly honest, really expensive. And perhaps they wouldn't find that it was that useful, and that would save them from investing in a technology which is not necessarily generating the benefits, and we still haven't seen the benefits in concrete terms that it does generate. So I actually think it is possible. Your second question, I'm afraid this is, the genie is so out of the bottle now. I think, I don't know how we're going to put some safeguards around this in any meaningful way at the moment, and certainly not in the current political climate. So I don't know, Zainab, I wish I knew. I wish I knew, but I'm afraid I don't. On that note, I'll pass it over to Pete.
Yeah, thanks for that simple question and simple handover. But yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the things that often gets missed in this conversation is, in the first sort of Bridges case, part of the judicial review, the district court ruled that the people have, everyone's rights were engaged by facial recognition, not just the people on the watch list, but the people that traverse past the camera. So I think that's important, and that's also my criticism of the Berlin and Nice ones, where they talk about, well, it's just volunteers, but it wasn't. They were just volunteers substitute for watch list people. The rest were the public. So it does mean we need this high threshold around testing. I guess I agree with it, and I was going to use the exact same phrase about the genie out of the bottle. You can't really sort of stop it. But the thing, I think, with technologies like facial recognition, I would argue there isn't a clear legal or explicit legal basis for it. So you need to have that in place before you can even think about testing anything in public. And I think because that's so contested and not clarified, and they're looking to try and legislate around that now, sort of 7-8 years after they were doing trials on it, kind of tells you everything you need to know. And I think one of the ways in which you can sort of make or institute better sort of processes at the start is have independent authorization before you use any of these technologies, before testing them. So it's not just a policing decision, there's a proper independent adjudication that authorizes them. At the moment, we don't have meaningful regulation of surveillance in the UK at all. And the only regulation we have is the ICO, which you may have seen in the news today, is in a bit of trouble, and there's a big, protest against their lack of enforcement. So I think you need independent authorization for the technology, but also independent authorization for any kind of testing in public.
Right, thank you very much. Well, we ran out of time now, but I'll just check if anyone would like to say any final words before we close. If not, then thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and the paper has been fascinating anyway. Thank you again for publishing your paper, and also for this discussion. We hope to see you again in future discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zainab.